Freud identified two primary instincts driving human behavior: Eros, the life instinct or libido, and Thanatos, the death instinct. Eros, ruled by the pleasure principle, is the sexual, creative impulse. Eros and Thanatos once balanced one another. Civilization altered this balance forever. Civilization was made possible by humans accepting what Freud called the reality principle, deferring gratification in the name of progress and security. The reality principle is sustained by internal and external repression. Freud also noted that continued repression of basic drives causes severe unhappiness and neurosis. Herbert Marcuse noted that, under capitalism, the performance principle has replaced the reality principle. A powerful elite exploited the reality principle to obtain profits and privilege, increasing repression to preserve civilization and increase production. To maintain their position, the elite rewards laborers with a small share of the wealth produced, from each according to his ability, to each according to his performance. Although technology could dramatically reduce the workday, this has not happened. Today's level of production is not necessary to meet society's needs, but it is necessary to preserve class privilege. The elite uses rewards, ideology, and force to maintain the aggressive production of goods and services. Marcuse called these coercive mechanisms surplus repression. Basic repression, delayed gratification, and cooperation with others built society. But surplus repression, the imposition of severe physical and mental restrictions on workers, exists solely to preserve the elite's social domination. Marcuse argued that the logic of domination, including the distribution of scarcity and aggressive overproduction, not only results in severe repression, but is the root cause of capitalism's endless wars fought over natural resources and markets. In a society based on domination, overproduction, and endless war, in a society that uses consumer goods to reward laborers with gadgets and distractions, to deaden the pain of severe repression, in this totally administered society, normality is a precarious condition. Modern identity is formed with what Marcuse called officially desired and advertised attitudes. These attitudes are defined by mass culture and are enforced by the rule of law, the law of the elite. This law is part of a totalitarian ideology based on the performance principle. While the law imposes external restraints, the ideology is internalized as self-repression. It is reality. Even cultural activities, sponsored by the government and big corporations, are an extension of the elite's control into the very soul of the modern individual. Under the rule of the performance principle, the pleasure principle is something frightful and terrifying. And if terror is not sufficient to control the workers, it has an ally: guilt. Self-consciousness, reason, and guilt have conquered and reshaped the world, using repression, external and internal. This repression has been redefined as freedom. Yet, despite this highly evolved repressive mechanism, some resistance survives, as Eros seeks to restore a life of balance and meaning. The conflict between id and superego, between pleasure and guilt, is also a conflict between the individual and society, between Eros and civilization. The ego struggles to balance this equation with mixed success. Periodically, a new generation engages in revolt against established authority. The rebellion is crushed with physical force. Terror ends the revolt, and repentance brings about the restoration and glorification of authority. The struggle for liberation ends in a reaffirmation of domination and totalitarianism. The performance principle has changed the very definition of pleasure, negating the positive energy of Eros, the libido. Rather than a celebration, life is drudgery, an officially sanctioned pleasure, a brief escape. Marcuse's erotic performance, human sexuality, has been restructured by the ruling elite. The daily struggle for existence and the elite's strategy of rewarding compliant, desexualized individuals redefines love itself. Erotic love, the capacity for directly experiencing a living, breathing world, has been replaced by a taboo-laden genital sexuality. But even this is not enough for the elite. The elite requires that its members practice productive love, sexuality limited to procreation in the service of the machine, maintained by repression and rewarded inhibitions. The process of mutilating human sexuality by restricting it to the genitals achieves complete desexualization of the worker. The libido is concentrated in one part of the body, leaving the rest free for labor. Severe repression is necessary to achieve and maintain desexualization. Work must remain a full-time occupation. If the workday was shortened, the worker's body, no longer used full-time as an instrument of labor, would be resexualized and consciousness restored. This would pose a threat to the elite. Desexualization has consequences. The repressed libido emerges in distorted, hideous forms, in sadistic acts useful to the elite, concentration camps, rendition, torture, murder. Brutality has become a norm in the civilized West. Occasionally, some offenders are punished for their excesses, but the harshest punishments are reserved mainly for whistleblowers. And yet, freedom is possible if the life instincts are allowed to generate lasting erotic relationships among mature individuals. Non-repressive erotic relations are gratified in activities that are not based in genital sexuality and yet are libidinal and erotic, life-affirming. But until Eros is freed from the constraints of the performance principle, human sexuality will remain a commodity and an instrument of repression. The modern worker performs a pre-established function. The value of the prefab individual is measured in terms of standardized skills rather than autonomous judgment and personal responsibility. Training for this role begins in school with the modern emphasis on standardized test results. Conformity is the sign of a responsible, well-trained adult. What is called integrity by the elite is compliant behavior that reflects the internalized ideology of the performance principle. This ideology reigns over the domesticated individual as self-repression. Conformity and integrity are accessories to the enslavement of humanity, rewarded with the gadgets of affluence, goods for the consumer. Once the individual has been fully integrated into a conformist state, he or she functions without a personal conscience. The sexually and ethically crippled members of society embody an alienation that supersedes any life-affirming impulse. Long hours of work, followed by limited options for self-expression, results in capital's cogs being resigned to their fate as expendable commodities, and their resignation is perpetuated by procreation. Civilization, with its system of rewarded inhibitions based on genital sexuality, uses the patriarch, the father figure, to perpetuate itself in every child. The institution of inherited private property gives the child an expectancy of a tolerable life in return for obedience to the performance principle. From childhood on, school trains the individual for a life of mundane, repetitive, meaningless tasks. Libido is channeled into socially useful performances. Later, adult workers maintain the machine and the class privileges of the elite. Every aspect of modern life is rational and rationed, including free time and access to information. Science and religion deny the hopes they once inspired and teach acceptance of alienation. Alienated labor, meaningless and numbing, is the calculated negation of the pleasure principle. Alienation makes the person an exchangeable function and the personality an ideology. Alienation cancels individuality in the name of productivity and a false individuality. Existing freedoms, including the electronic gadgets of affluence, are themselves instruments of repression. Society allows only controlled, prefabricated happiness. Like the ability to forget, the ability to remember is state-administered. The memory of obligations, contracts, dues, these things are to be remembered. All else is forgotten. Unfreedom controls behavior and thought under the name of freedom. Having been taught that life cannot last anyways, that every pleasure is fleeting, individuals are resigned to death even before society forces them to practice resignation methodically at the workplace. Central to the performance principle's logic of domination is the work ethic, coupled with an unconscious flight from pain, want, and alienation, a simultaneous race against time, and a desire for death. It is only beyond the patriarchal and authoritarian performance principle, the deification of production, and the desire for death, that the images of a free future reside. But desire for change is labeled utopian by the elite. The rejection of hope is itself a key part of the performance principle and its sanctioned ideology. State violence and the culture of consumerism are powerful constraints, but this operant conditioning is further enhanced by the war on terror. Terrorism provides the elite with justification for endless war, a source of natural resources, windfall profits, and a means of social control. War and the permanent war economy are a key part of the total administration of a population. Our capacity for self-destruction has kept pace with our technological advances. Cruelty, hatred, and scientific genocide have increased in relation to the possibility of ending oppression, perpetuating a destructiveness beyond all rationality. The production of wasteful and destructive goods has inflicted bodily and mental mutilations on the empire's workers and soldiers. The struggle for existence under the performance principle breeds resentment as well as resignation. This, too, is a commodity. The performance principle transforms the death instinct into socially useful aggression. The lack of fulfillment in life enhances the instinctual value of death. When sanctioned by the state, inflicting terror on others is assimilated with normality. This is the fatal dialectic of civilization. Civilization itself leads to the release of increasingly destructive forces. Thanatos ascends over Eros. Endless war and technological advances have given birth to sadomasochism, enacted on an international stage. This barbarism is a new, civilized brutality. Concentration camps, military prisons, kidnapping, torture, extrajudicial executions, and remote control drone attacks. Beneath the rationalized motives for endless war, we find the death drive, evident in the persistent approval and participation of the victims. In a repressive civilization, death itself becomes an instrument of repression. Whether death is feared as constant threat, accepted as fate, or glorified as supreme sacrifice, the descent towards death is taught in school, church, the military, and the workplace. The lesson: one must submit to the logic of domination and surrender to death. It is inevitable. It is release. This tortured logic extends into every aspect of human society, including human interaction with nature, epitomized in the destructive harvesting of resources for consumer goods and energy sources, and the release of vast amounts of waste products into the environment. Nature is literally being violated at a frantic pace, and as a result, things are heating up. Resistance to endless war, unnatural disaster, and the performance principle does exist. The refusal does not require missiles or bombs, but it does require something much harder to produce: uncensored and unmanipulated knowledge. What passes for reason is but an ideology, the ideology of terrorism and national security. Meeting the requirements of the national security state comes at a great cost. No funding for health care, jobs, or education. The workday cannot be reduced. Life cannot be celebrated as long as the war on terror, drugs, and hope rages on. Freedom isn't free, the elites say, and yet they prosper. The one-dimensional propaganda of the elite is the ideology of death and privilege. Autonomy, creativity, and a full life are a privilege reserved for the very few. For the majority, there is only work and death. Access to the necessities of life is a prerequisite for a truly free society. Technological advances could facilitate this. Labor would continue, but the organization of the human existence as an instrument of labor would end. The quest is for nothing less than the liberation of humanity from inhuman existential conditions. A real rebellion, a great refusal to continue down the dead end, would use existing wealth to reshape the world in accordance with the life instinct, defeating the purveyors of death, ending their wars, and using their profits to meet human needs. Complete liberation must involve ending the repression imposed on sensuousness. Sexuality is the realm where the individual connects with the species. An unrepressed sexuality that transcends procreation and taboo-laden genital sexuality would connect humanity in its entirety and would help to make life an end in itself. As an organizing principle of civilization, life as an end in itself would release the imagination of the artist resident in all beings, an imagination that allows reality to be comprehended more fully. We live in a period where the machinery of the elite punishes nonconformity with ridicule and crushes resistance with brute force, precisely because we have never come so close to the fulfillment of our hopes. We have never been so strictly restrained from attaining them. But technology and the productive forces that imprison us could be used to free humanity. The choice is yours. Refuse. Resist.